Hello and welcome to our week 3 lecture number 3. This week we're going to be talking about the Bronze Age, just like last week, but now we're moving on down to Egypt. So, where last we left off, we were talking about Mesopotamia. So, this map is just a quick reference point to give you a little bit of a geographical context here. The green bit there is where we were last week. We were talking about Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, what is now mostly Iraq, with a little bit of Iran and some Syria mixed in there. So that green part there, headed down toward the Persian Gulf, that's where Mesopotamia is. This week, we're moving to the south and west, down where that tan color is, and we're talking about Egypt. Okay, so Egypt shares a couple of geographical things in common with Mesopotamia. This is going to be a major agricultural region, very productive, and really centered around a river, in this case, the Nile River. Where it's a little bit different from Mesopotamia is that Egypt is even more extreme in its climate. As you can see from this satellite photograph, that little green ribbon is the land that is irrigated by and immediately adjacent to the Nile River. Everything else is desert. It is really, really arid in Egypt most of the year, almost all the time. There's almost no rainfall. It's extremely, extremely dry, except for the river. The river is fed by snowfall in the mountains to the south. And the map next to the satellite picture gives you a breakdown of how ancient Egyptians talked about their own, I guess you could call it a country, might be a little bit of a misleading term at the time, but how they talked about their own region and how they drew it on their own maps. Now, in North America, we very typically, when we draw a map of the world, we'll put north at the top and south at the bottom. And this can be a little bit misleading when you talk about ancient Egypt because they use the Nile as their reference point. So when they say Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, it's actually the reverse of the way many North Americans picture that on a map. So Upper Egypt, they're talking about higher elevation up in the mountains to the south. Upper Egypt is the south part of the map, while Lower Egypt is the bottom of the river where it becomes the delta and empties into the Mediterranean. So when I say Lower Egypt, what I mean is that lowland Egypt. And when I say Upper Egypt or Middle Egypt, I'm talking about moving upland, not to the north, but rather moving to the south. The map also shows and gives you a little indication of another characteristic of Egypt that is very important to know. Settlements and cities, city-sized settlements, are incredibly dense in that territory immediately beside the Nile, but almost non-existent away from it. All of the settlements are going to be right along the river, and there's going to be lots of them. And the reason there's going to be so many is because even more than in Mesopotamia, the Nile is tremendously productive. This Nile Valley is going to produce tons and tons and tons and tons of food. So this farming area has the potential to create enormous surpluses so that people can live in quite dense populations, but they are absolutely kind of tethered to the Nile River itself. If they go too far outside of town, they end up in the desert, and the desert can only support so many people, and it's not a very high number. So people are very much concentrated right along the river. That's where it's possible to grow things and keep animals and have enough food to get by. So that makes sense. This is going to have a lot of important historical impacts, this geographical reality. But before we get into all of them, let's talk a little bit about Egypt's geography when it comes to defense. As you can see, there's this narrow strip of farmable land, arable land, that goes through the middle of what you can see from the satellite photograph is desert. Because that's the case, Egypt is very inaccessible from the west. Trying to come and attack Egypt across the desert is a losing proposition. There's no way to get an army that way. It's very, very difficult, if not impossible. It is possible but difficult to come at Egypt from the south as well, because that's where it turns into mountains to the south. And the Kingdom of Nubia, which is to the south, occasionally does interact in a hostile way with Egypt. More often they're trade partners, but they occasionally do interact hostilely with Egypt, and there's going to be some takeover periods, etc. But for the most part, Egypt isn't all that vulnerable to the south either, because of the defensive status of the mountains that are down there. And then if you look to the east, you have the Red Sea, which makes it very difficult for Bronze Age people to come and pester Egypt, because in the Bronze Age, there really aren't that many people who have ships and boats and can use them in any kind of a naval attack kind of a way. And certainly there aren't many peoples that could do that more efficiently than the Egyptians themselves could. So that really leaves a tiny, narrow access point. You have the sea to the top, the Mediterranean Sea to the north. You have the Red Sea to the east. You have the desert to the west. You have the mountains to the south. And you have that tiny little bit of land that goes toward the Sinai Peninsula. It looks like a miniature India there. But you have that tiny little bit of land that connects Egypt through the Sinai Peninsula to the Arabian Peninsula and to what is now Israel and Palestine and Jordan and all of those wonderful places on the Eastern Mediterranean. So really, if you were going to try to attack Egypt from outside, the only real access point is this very narrow, very restricted area. This is going to have a lot of impact on how Egypt historically is going to develop. Unlike Mesopotamia, where you have those highlands, the Zagros Mountains, where people keep coming and crossing and moving into Mesopotamia basically constantly. You can approach Mesopotamia from the north and from the west as well. And so what happens in the great city-states and kingdoms of Mesopotamia is that over and over and over again, they get attacked, they get conquered, waves of people come and take over. That doesn't happen in Egypt, at least in large part, because it's very difficult to do that in Egypt, just geographically speaking. The other thing that's important to note about Egypt, other advantages, the Nile is navigable, meaning you can get boats up and down it pretty safely most of the year. When it's in flood, or I guess there are some times when it's really, really low, but it's very rare. When it's in flood, the Nile can be dangerous. But for the most part, most of the year, you can move boats and barges up and down the Nile relatively easily. That's going to make communication between all of these cities and settlements very easy. It's going to make trade very easy. And it's going to make administration much easier too, because everybody has to perch all of these towns right on the banks of the Nile, or very, very close to it. And so you don't have a large spread out mass of territory to try to control as a leader, because everybody has to live right next to the Nile. They can't go off into the desert very far, or they will be in the desert. So this situation, the geography of Egypt, is going to really lend itself to a very unusual set of political consequences. It's hard to attack from outside. Trade and communication and travel are quite speedy and easy in Egypt because you can use the Nile for all of that. You can use water to move goods and people and information much more efficiently than you can in any of the other kingdoms of the world at this time and later. So Egypt already, just by its geography, is going to be set up to be the kind of place that really lends itself to unified kingdoms and long-lasting unity. We'll get into that. We're going to emphasize that over and over again. If you remember one thing about Egypt that makes it special and different from basically everywhere else we're going to talk about, Egypt is going to be tremendously politically stable compared to everywhere else. Mesopotamia is the only place we've really talked about, but we're going to talk about a bunch of other places following Egypt, and it's going to be true of them as well. Egypt has a lot of natural advantages that are going to end up meaning that it's going to have a lot of political stability compared to everywhere else in the world. Okay, so let's talk about how that plays out. Okay, so in Egypt, we see cities emerge right about, well, just a little bit later. The very first cities in Egypt are just slightly younger. And when I say slightly, I mean that in a very relative term. We see structures that we would identify as kind of fully evolved cities in the 3000s in Mesopotamia. And we see them emerge just slightly after that in Egypt as well. So the oldest cities are in Mesopotamia. The oldest united kingdom of more than one city is very likely Mesopotamia as well. But Egypt is going to follow hot on the heels of that. We see evidence, archaeologically speaking, of political unification of what we call Upper Egypt, which is that southern mountainous part, and Lower Egypt in this very stunning artifact. I'm going to take a tiny step aside for just a moment and talk about another geographical feature of Egypt I probably should have emphasized. One of the reasons archaeologists have such a beautifully good time with Egypt, why we love it so much, why Egypt is talked about in tones of reverence and awe when you get archaeologists and historians together to talk about the ancient world, is because such a wealth of records survive, even really quite old pieces of art and pieces of writing are going to survive from Egypt in a way that you just don't find anywhere else. Mesopotamia is pretty good in this score, but nobody compares to Egypt. And a lot of the reason for that really is broken into two parts. First is what I mentioned just a minute ago. Egypt is tremendously politically stable. And when you have a lot of stability, that lends itself to the preservation of records. Because when you have conquests and new people taking over, there's a tendency for cities to get burned down and records to be destroyed and the previous administration's monuments to get smashed up and all of that stuff. In addition to that, Egypt's climate. Remember how I just mentioned, if you get anywhere away from the river, it's enormously arid. It's very, very dry. And so if you were to, say, want to preserve some object or another, you could seal it in a clay jar, even if it's made of papyrus, something that should be a fairly decayable, that's not the right word, but it should be something that wouldn't last for half a second if you were to put it in a damp dirt of a damp climate in, say, Germany or something. Papyrus would break down relatively quickly. But in Egypt, if you seal it up in a clay jar and bury it in the desert, it is entirely possible to find it 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years later, unearth it, unseal the jar, pull out the papyrus, and have it still be readable. In such a good state of preservation. Practically everything is that way. Now, things that are exposed to sand erosion can be broken down, but there's a lot of things built out of stone in Egypt because there isn't a lot of trees and not a lot of wood that's hanging around, and that lasts a tremendously long time. And then you add in the sort of natural preservative effect of the climate, where things just don't get decayed or broken down by insects in the way that they do elsewhere in other types of climates. And so much survives. The record is so complete compared to so many other parts of the world. Now that I've blathered about that, we'll get back on our topic. We see some of the first evidence of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt from about 3200 BC. So a big regional empire is formed here by this guy. His name that we've uncovered is sometimes rendered as Menes, M-E-N-E-S, sometimes as Narmer. This particular artifact is known as the Narmer Palette, and it gives a pictorial representation of this unification that I was just talking about. You see on one side, the part on the left there, you have the king, who will later be known as the pharaoh, but isn't at this point. Pharaoh is just from the Egyptian, it means big house. But here you have the king. He's standing there in a crown, in the white crown, and he has in his hand, you could call it a mace or a scepter. Probably Mace is more accurate. And he's got an enemy kneeling at his feet, and he's about to smack the enemy right in the head. So you have this image of victory. You have the king victorious over his enemies. There's a couple more enemies under his feet looking upset. And next to him, you have a little figure who's carrying his sandals. That's what he's doing there. And then on the other side, you have a representational symbolic figure You have the Falcon of Horus there, that represents Horus, that represents the mountainous part of Upper Egypt, and he's standing on top of that papyrus boat that represents Lower Egypt. So you have the symbols of Upper and Lower Egypt united next to the image of the king smashing his enemies. And if that wasn't clear enough, the flip side of the palette, you have the king again. In this case, he's up there in the top left, right underneath one of those Hathor bulls. Yeah, cows. She's actually a cow, a goddess. And you can see here the red crown of Lower Egypt. And the king is definitely the king. He's way bigger than the other people in that frame. And he's walking. He's still got his mace in his hand, symbol of his authority. And he's overseeing. So you can see the standard bearers. They've got those poles with symbols on top. His sandal carrier is behind him still. And then you can see how he's defeated his enemies because they're all laid out in a row with their heads chopped off and their heads between their feet. So they are well and truly defeated. And below that, you can see some more symbolic representations. In the very, very bottom, the tip there, you can see again the image here of a bull who is smashing through a city wall, smashing an enemy. This, of course, is a representation of the conquest that he's made. And then you have these exciting animals that are standing next to each other. They're called serpopards. And they've got these like snaky necks, but they're leopards. I don't know. But at any rate, this is where we get the name palette from. This is why we call it a palette. That's actually what it was. This was meant to be probably a ritual object, but one that had some significance to the king. In that little like center area between the necks of the serpopards where they twine together and make that kind of gap, that hole, that is where the king would have mixed his eye makeup. So the eyeliner that we associate with Egyptians, ancient Egyptians, if you've seen any artistic depictions, that was worn for a number of reasons, partly for aesthetic effect, partly to make the eye look very bigger and the person look more imposing, and partly just practicality. That thick black eyeliner actually protects the eyes in a very sunny environment like Egypt. It fights glare. It's the same reason football players wear that eye black on their face. Anyway, so here we have this palette. It depicts the victory of the king. It shows him in both styles of crown, the crown of Upper Egypt and the crown of Lower Egypt. It has the symbol that shows the unification of Egypt, of Upper and Lower Egypt. And so we have this artifact from about 3200 BC that shows the unification of both sides of the river into one big kingdom. As an extra bonus, we have another artifact. Now, why he was called the Scorpion King, this was originally archaeologists, before they had translated hieroglyphic, referred to this king who united Upper and Lower Egypt. They didn't have a name for him, but they found evidence of him elsewhere, references to that same kind of victory and the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. And they called him the Scorpion King because next to him, in a place that we associate with having the names of the king recorded, was a picture of a scorpion. And so we didn't know what his name was actually before we figured out it was Menes or Narmer. And so he was referred to as the Scorpion King. Now, this particular artifact is a stone mace head. It probably was meant to be an artistic piece, not something that was used, but I don't know. And on the mace head, this would be that stick that Pharaoh was smiting his enemies with a second ago. That it depicts the same kind of like military victory, and you've got a picture of the king and he's uniting up. There he is. You have the papyrus fan behind him. It's very exciting. Okay, so he's got the white crown of Upper Egypt on his head, and elsewhere he is clearly the same king. Okay, now before we move on, I want to emphasize that image that I just showed you, that last one where the Pharaoh smites his enemies, this is going to be, even though we first see it in an artifact from 3200 BC, or at least that's one of the earlier representations of it, this is going to be absolutely standard. The kings that come after Menes or Narmer are going to reuse this image over and over and over again. They're going to reuse the regalia, the crown, and the united crown of Upper and Lower Egypt over and over and over again. And so I just want to emphasize it. You see it here, 3200 BC. Now keep your eyes peeled because we're going to see it again. Okay. In the intervening time, let's talk about how things politically develop. Now, we're fast forwarding over quite a lot. If you have a chance ever to take a class in ancient Egypt all by itself, I strongly recommend that you do, because it's fascinating and wicked cool. Same thing goes with Mesopotamia, and absolutely deserves its whole semester and more. But for our purposes, since we've got to get through this pretty quick, we're going to have to fast forward. So, skipping over a whole bunch of things, cities. During this time period between Menes and Narmer and what we're about to get to with the Old Kingdom, many of them still have walls around them. Many of them are kind of doing their own thing until, and there's kind of kings who come and go, until about 2686, 2690 BC or so. At which point you have a king who takes over, who is strong enough and powerful enough and exercises enough control and has a large enough army that he consolidates all the cities that are along the banks of the Nile into a single kingdom. And we refer to this as the Old Kingdom. It lasts about 500-ish years. Historians squabble a bit over the beginnings and ends of these eras, but you don't have to know it with any great precision. But the Old Kingdom, what you should remember about it is you have a functional government that emerges to unite the cities along the bank of the Nile. These independent city-states, which were referred to as nomes, are going to be united, and they're all going to have to be ruled by the same king, and they have to pay taxes to the king. That's how the king is going to maintain his big army that he's going to use to keep everybody in line. And the cult of the king kind of evolves at this time as well, so that the king is beginning to promote himself not just as god-like or hanging out with gods, as we saw with the law code of Hammurabi and in Mesopotamia. This should be part of what we discuss during our Zoom meeting this week. Kings in Mesopotamia often depict themselves as serving the gods. They depict themselves as chummy with the gods on various occasions. They depict themselves as acting on behalf of the gods, being tight with them, but they don't make that next leap that the Egyptians do. The Egyptians are going to refer to themselves as gods. They're going to blur the line between the divine and the royal. And it's, well, I would hope that it's fairly clear why you might want to do this as a king. You might want people to believe that you're a god, because if people believe that you're a god, they're more likely to obey you. They're less likely to object when you boss them around. They're less likely to rebel against you if you're a god. So it makes some sense why you would want people to think you're a god. And so the question really becomes, why don't the rulers of other places call themselves gods if it's something that has these advantages? Well, most of the time, that's because rulers of other places can't get anybody to believe that. If you were looking at Mesopotamia, for instance, has those invaders that keep coming in every so often. They have to maintain city walls around all of their city-states. The kings of the Old Kingdom in Egypt are going to get rid of those. They're like, okay, cities, I don't want you to have walls around yourselves anymore. And the reason the Egyptians can do that, but the Mesopotamians can't, is because Egypt is really hard to attack from outside. So if everybody's united into one kingdom, and you don't have to worry about your neighboring town attacking you, the odds of being attacked from anybody else are slim to none. There's nobody that can come and attack you then. So if the king unites all of these cities and says, get rid of your walls, that has a couple of effects. One is that you don't have to go to the expense and trouble of building walls. Two, if you were to say, want to defy the king, you no longer have a wall to hide behind. In Mesopotamia, they did. And so civil uprisings were more common. They had their own garrisons to protect them from invaders. They had their own walls. They had invasions all the time to deal with. In addition to that, the Tigris and Euphrates flood unpredictably. You never know when you're going to get a big flood or a small flood or a major weather event or an earthquake. Those are fairly common in Mesopotamia as well. And so if you run around pretending to be a god or claiming to be a god, and then you can't do anything to stop invaders and uprisings and earthquakes and floods, nobody's going to believe you. It doesn't make any sense. In Egypt, The kings claim to be gods and they get away with it for centuries because things are just that stable. It's almost impossible for outsiders to invade. They can't do it very easily. It's not totally impossible, but it's almost impossible. Cities have a harder time rebelling because they don't have their own walls. They don't maintain their own garrisons. In addition to that, communication is so much easier. Travel is so much easier. The Nile floods at certain predictable times, and the pharaoh is able to predict usually how much it's going to flood in any given year, because what influences that is not rainfall. What influences that is the snow up in the mountains. So if you send a scouting party down in the early spring or late winter to climb up in the mountains to the south, they can take measurements and find out how much snow there is and how much it's going to melt and how big the flood is going to be that year. So they can come trotting back down and report to the pharaoh or to the king, who can then tell everybody, this year will be a big flood. And then it is. This year, people will not invade, and then they don't. This year, we're going to plant crops and reap a huge harvest, and then they do. Conditions are enormously stable in Egypt compared to everybody else and everywhere else. And so the king is able to encourage people to treat him as a god, and the royal family as not exactly human, as kind of human manifestations of gods on earth. And that works. People go for it. Now, it's almost impossible to know for a fact what individual people privately believed. It's really, really difficult to know what people's personal feelings and thoughts are. But the cult of the king, of owing veneration and worship to the king and deceased kings that went before, is very popular. It's widespread and it's very common. Around the king is going to rise up an administrative class, a bureaucratic class of people whose jobs include keeping records of the tax rolls, keeping track of what's being farmed where, keeping track of what temples are being built and who's staffing them. Basically, all of the business of running a town, everything from the courts, the local kind of small claims court, where if you have a dispute, magistrates will hear them, all the way to the major palace and running the king's household. All of those tasks have people who are going to emerge as a professional class of bureaucrats to deal with them. This is sometimes referred to as the scribal class, people who can write. Writing system is going to emerge in Egypt as well. It's not linked. It's not related to cuneiform. It emerges in kind of the same way, sort of, that cuneiform does. It starts as a pictographic language where you have a little picture that represents an idea. And usually these are quite simplified, just drawings of things. So you have a little picture of a sheep and that represents a sheep, for instance, or a papyrus or whatever else. And we sometimes refer to these as like hieroglyphic. And then over time, this hieroglyphic system is going to shift and evolve and turn into something that is more representational, where you have an entire language that will be captured, not just one picture equals one word, but it turns into something more syllabic. We have something called demotic script, and that is going to emerge over time. But reading and writing is something that a special class of people do, this scribal class. And if you can read and write, that is pretty much a guarantee in Egypt that you are going to have a plush governmental job at your fingertips. Okay, so that being said, this Old Kingdom is also referred to as the Age of the Pyramids. This is when all of the pyramids are going to be designed, developed, and built during this Old Kingdom. You can see kind of the ancestor of the pyramid here. This is what's known as a step pyramid. It was something, according to most historians, kind of innovated by a vizier, a person who's a high administrator, named Imhotep, who was the vizier to King Djoser. And he is going to expand on a style of tomb that was very popular in Egypt called a Mastaba Tomb. So if you were to take one of those layers, if you picture the step pyramid as kind of a cake, if you were just to take that bottom layer, so you have that flat, sort of horizontal piece with kind of angled sides. That's what's known as a Mastaba tomb. They were popular for very wealthy and important people in Egypt, partly because, again, of the geographical conditions. People buried their dead away from where they're actually doing their farming and irrigating the land, because you wouldn't want to use the land for that kind of a purpose. So they buried their dead, usually a little bit out into the desert. And because the desert is indeed soft sand, and it moves around with the wind, and dunes shift and change, there's a desire when people are burying their deceased relatives that they want to not just put a marker that will be permanent and allow people to come along and find the spot of the grave, but also to create a kind of a security feature so that the graves won't just be uncovered by shifting dunes. And so in order to make it more secure, you build this kind of stone structure that was meant to stabilize the ground, keep it all in place, and so the person would be buried inside or beneath this Mastaba tomb. So that's the deal. Keep them safe from now into eternity. Imhotep comes up with the idea of stacking these mastabas on top of each other to create this pyramid shape. It's a step pyramid, but it's a roughly triangular kind of a shape. And this is a major leap forward. Kings are going to adopt this. The first person who does it is a king. They're going to adopt this as a way to accomplish a couple of different things. One, it marks as really much more visually obvious the grave of a king. And these grave sites would become the centers of veneration and worship because the kings are being venerated as gods. And so a temple would be built nearby. People could come, offer sacrifices, say prayers, generally participate in the worship of the spirit of the king now that he's left his mortal body behind and has ascended into the heavens to deal with the other gods. It also is a symbolic structure, just the same way we saw with the ziggurat pyramids of Mesopotamia. When you create something this shape, it becomes an artificial mountain. And mountains have this great symbolic significance to people all the world over. It's a connection between the earth and the heavens in a literal way. This is meant to be a conduit that helps the spirit of the king ascend into the heavens after death and help look out for Egypt from beyond the grave. And it's also meant to be a visually imposing sight. So if a person comes over the horizon and sees an artificial mountain, it's very impressive and it makes them feel great. In addition to that, there's a great practical application for this kind of large-scale tomb building. Now, this step pyramid and all the pyramids that come after it are tombs. That's what they are. They just hold the body of the pharaoh and some various goods, etc. That's it. They're mostly solid. They cannot be used for grain storage, no matter what somebody suggests, because they're not hollow. But all they really do in terms of function is serve as monuments to the dead king. They're tombs. That's all they do. And so that doesn't mean they're useless, but it's a tremendous amount of expense and work for something that doesn't. This isn't like building an irrigation canal, for instance, where you invest very heavily in building that, but then it reaps rewards by producing money. The pyramids don't do that directly. They just are kind of there as monuments and reminders. So it's a way of putting together an interesting influence on the economy. So on one hand, it's kind of a conspicuous consumption. Even though this is really just meant to be a monument to a king who is dead, it nevertheless ends up a way to infuse a lot of money into the living economy. So kings in the Old Kingdom are collecting large amounts of grain surplus as their taxes. They're turning that into trade goods. We'll get to that in just a bit. And bringing in things from around the world. They're using that to support their participation in the Bronze Age by bringing in the raw materials for that and building weapons and tools and all the kinds of things they need. But beyond that, unlike in Mesopotamia, the kings of Egypt don't need to invest heavily in building city walls. They just don't have that expense on the ledger. They also don't need to invest very heavily in maintaining large armies because, once again, they don't really have outside attackers to worry about. So they have this tremendous big surplus. So what to do with that to encourage stability and loyalty among your people? Well, one of the things you can do with that is hire them to build you a fabulous. So there's a lot of debates over exactly what the status of people are who work on pyramids in the Old Kingdom. They are not, and this is just a side note, I'm not going to get into it in too much detail, but if there was a point at which ancient Israelites were sojourning in Egypt, and I'm not saying there was not, but if that happened, it was not when they were building pyramids. They may have built some things, but certainly not pyramids, because the Old Kingdom was well and truly over before that would have happened. But regardless, the people who built pyramids were very likely more or less pressed into service from farm levies. And I say this based on the sheer number of people who were involved. These pyramids were enormous scale projects. Enormous. They would be built during the pharaoh's lifetime. This isn't something that people worked on for hundreds of years. In the case of Sneferu, for instance, he's the guy who really kind of cracked the code of how to put a pyramid together. He's going to build 3 of them in his lifetime just to get it right. So they're built during the pharaoh's lifetime. And that means they had enormous scale workforce. Lots and lots and lots of people had to be working in order to make these structures. So you had to have people quarrying stone. You had to have people designing, arranging, building. And how they were built is fairly straightforward. If you've ever heard the phrase, the mystery of the pyramids, you've been misled, because there's really no mystery attached to the pyramids. We know who built them, we know why they built them, we know when they built them, and basically, with a few minor details left out, we know how they built them. There's really no mystery there. But what it does show us is just the tremendous amount of resources that the kings of Egypt could command, and did command, to build these essential monuments to themselves. And what it does is it puts people to work. So if you have a farm economy, there's going to be a growing season where people are very busy, and a season where they're not necessarily as busy. And so very likely, just based on the sheer number of people, I keep saying that, there's only so many people who are, I guess you could say, legally slaves in Egypt, people who are treated as chattel, bought and sold, owned by others. That's very likely not the great majority of people who worked on the pyramids, because there just weren't enough slaves to do that. It wasn't cost effective. Instead, what very likely was the case is that in the off season, farmers were called upon to work on the pyramid. They may have volunteered, it's possible. They may have been pushed into doing this job whether they wanted to or not. If that's the case, you can argue about whether this is free labor or slave labor if you want. But what I can tell you is that the archaeological sites that we've uncovered that shed some light into what the workers were like, because around each pyramid site, the building site, there are archaeological sites that show the housing that pyramid workers were kept in. It shows the kitchens that prepared the food for the pyramid workers, the pens where animals were kept. And what it shows is that people who worked on the pyramid were fed quite well. That doesn't mean they weren't slaves, but they were fed quite well. You have big livestock pens, for instance, that show quite the percentage of meat that was being butchered and served to people. People were fed in bread every day, grains, and they were fed in beer. All of these things were provided. In addition to that, it's possible they were paid. It may be and it may not be, but they certainly were fed while they were working. And they certainly were supplied with all of the things that they needed in order to work on the pyramid. And so that alone could end up making a big difference in a farming family's life. If you're likely young men, so dad and teenage kids, for instance, teenage boys, could go off for part of the year and work on the pyramid and be fed during that time and have all of their supplies supplied for them. Even if they didn't get paid a wage to come home with, this could end up taking a lot of economic pressure off the family, feeding people in the lean times when they're not actively farming. And it is possible they were paid, so we don't know. But at any rate, the process of developing a pyramid, if you've ever heard the phrase, the mystery of the pyramid, as I just mentioned, often when people talk about it, what they really mean, where they're really coming from is they look at the Great Pyramid, which we're about to get to in a second. And they're like, wow, the Great Pyramid is enormously tall. It's almost 500 feet tall. The sides of it are so close. They're so precise. They're off by 4 centimeters, the different lengths of the sides. The thing is so beautiful. It's so perfect. It's so massive. It couldn't possibly have been made by human beings. It has to be aliens or some kind of nonsense. And people who say that conveniently ignore all of the pyramids that didn't work out so great. For instance, so this isn't something that just popped onto the earth from nowhere. There was a process. Sneferu, for instance, I sort of mentioned it here, went through 3 different pyramids in attempting to perfect the process. This is known as the Maidun Pyramid. It fell down. There was a 7-step central structure, a Mastaba step pyramid, and then the outside was faced with smooth limestone. And in the process, it sort of collapsed and didn't work out very well. It didn't work. So Sneferu tries again. This time, you get the bent pyramid at Dashur. It starts at about 55 degrees, and it was constructed, as far as we can tell, the same way that all other pyramids are going to be constructed, basically from the center outward. And you would put together ramps out of packed dirt, so that as you got to the top of the pyramid, you climb up the ramp, you drag the stones up these ramps, put them into place, and then as you finish the pyramid, you knock down the ramps as you go, so that when you get back down to the ground, you just wipe them all away, and that's it. So at any rate, they start at this angle about 55 degrees, which would have made this thing really tall. And they get to a point about halfway up, and they're like, oh, shoot, it's too steep, and we can't get the things up the ramps, and it's not working out, and it's just, this is really bad. So they change the angle abruptly, kind of halfway, and they're like, okay, we'll finish the rest of it at a shallower angle, and maybe no one will notice. It's completely noticeable. So Sneferu tries again. And here we have it, the success. The Red Pyramid at Dashur. It's not nearly as big as the Great Pyramid. We'll see that next. But it is kind of the perfected vision of the pyramid. The sides are kind of equal length. It's all one smooth angle from beginning to end. The inside is built out of red limestone blocks, which are quarried very close by. And then it was faced originally with white limestone, which was quarried from a little bit further away, but created a smooth surface. All of the pyramids after this point, and even a few before that had been damaged, you can see it in the bent pyramid as well, would have had this smooth facing of white limestone put on the outside of them. That's an important thing to note because, of course, the pyramid now doesn't look like that. All of that white limestone got looted at various points, some in the ancient world, some in the modern world, and it ended up building the city of Cairo. But that white limestone on the outside that smoothed this surface out, it takes this enormous, huge structure, this artificial mountain, and remember that it is just kind of rising up out of the desert. It's very close to where Cairo is now, the pyramids. And if you were to ride over the horizon in the ancient world, what you would have seen in the glaring Egyptian sun, and it's always sunny in Egypt, what you would have seen in the glaring Egyptian sun is this enormous artificial mountain that was made of smooth white stone. The thing would have glowed. It would have been dazzling to the eye. And so it's this monument, it's this massive, unbelievable thing. There are more than 2 million blocks that weigh between 6 and 10 tons each. They were quarried fairly close, most of the blocks, to the pyramid site, and then dragged using rollers to the pyramid itself and then put in place. It requires, it's a monument to human achievement. It really is. It requires a massive amount of planning. It requires complicated engineering. It requires people to have a good sense of geometry. And all those things are something ancient people were absolutely 100% capable of. So if anybody comes along and says the pyramid is some kind of result of an alien and humans couldn't possibly have done it, remember how condescending an idea that is. especially when you see it applied to things like Egypt. This is Egypt, 2560 BC or so is when the Great Pyramid was built, after more than a century of trial and error, I want to emphasize. People will say ancient aliens when they look at Egypt or the pyramids of the Maya or other people. But despite the tremendous skill presented by these people who did the quarrying and the shaping and the moving, designed the interior of the pyramid, which has a couple of different passageways and chambers. It is mostly solid, the Great Pyramid and all pyramids, but there are openings where the burial chamber of the king would be put in some, kind of safe fake out places. There's a few things inside, but for the most part, the thing is solid. Despite the monument of human achievement that this represents, it is a relatively simple geometric figure. It is mostly solid, and it is fairly straightforward, and it is in the shape that is the most stable shape you can build out of all of them. This thing will never tip over because it's just not shaped in a way that it can. It's the most stable, most secure. I wouldn't say the easiest, but it's up there in terms of simplest structure you can build. Now, nothing about it was truly simple because of just the massive amount of work involved, but it's fairly straightforward. If you compare this with something like the Roman aqueduct, in terms of what kind of level of engineering, surveying, and precision was required, it's, in some ways, you see the kind of artistic precision being equivalent, but the aqueduct is something that is much, much more complex. We'll get to that in weeks later. And yet nobody ever looks at the ancient Roman aqueduct, which used the same kind of tools that built the pyramid, and said, aliens must have done that. So ask yourself the next time somebody suggests this to you, why they can't believe that Egyptians could build a pile of rocks. Okay, so sorry, not to get too diverted, but we're going to move on. Humans are capable of astonishing things. People in the ancient world were just as smart as people in the modern world. Nothing really has changed. People are people everywhere and at all times. Okay, so going on, you have this great pyramid of Kufu. Now, what do these pyramids all mean? Well, each of them had a temple complex that was built to go alongside them. They were places where people could come and venerate the pharaoh. They were places where people could come and make sacrifices and communicate and access records, and they ended up being kind of a tourist destination. They did all of these things, and they were ways to reinforce the veneration of the pharaoh as divine. They had all of those impacts. They were enormously expensive, as you can probably imagine. Building something the size of the Great Pyramid in 20 years, which is about as long as it took to build it, requires the mobilization of an enormous workforce. They had to, if they built it in that time period, be quarrying, moving, and placing somewhere between 300 and 500 of those 10-ton blocks a day, which means a huge amount of physical labor, a huge amount of manpower. So what this effectively does is it takes that surplus that the king is collecting with his Bronze Age redistributive economy, and he takes it, and then by employing this big a percentage of the population, he's essentially putting them to a job and then giving that surplus back out. He's distributing the wealth back into the pockets of people who are working. And not only the people working on the pyramid directly are being paid, but everybody that provides any kind of support service, anybody who provides the food that the pyramid workers are eating, and the beer, and the various other travel means that are bringing people in to work on the pyramid and bringing them home afterwards. All of those industries are going to get a boost because the pharaoh is paying for this. So monumental building is one way that kings in all parts of the ancient world and beyond are going to redistribute money from their pocket back into the community and back into the local economy. By the way, the pyramids are going to end up falling out of favor, in part because they're expensive and because every pharaoh wants their pyramid to be just as good, if not better, than the pyramid of the guy who comes before. And they get to a point where it's like, okay, if we made it any bigger or grander than this, it would just be awful and ridiculous and even possibly expensive. And we just don't want to do that. And on top of that, they all get robbed. They get robbed in the ancient world. They're impossible to keep secure. It was an enormous frustration for the ancient Egyptians, and they decide to quit them in the Old Kingdom. Okay, so back into the wealth of ancient Egypt. Why was it possible to put this many people, at least 200,000 people altogether, to work on building something that was essentially kind of useless? It's a monument and a tomb for the dead king. Why is it possible in Egypt to do this? Well, it's because, as I mentioned earlier, Egypt's agricultural economy is tremendously, hugely, massively productive. They produce lots and lots and lots of grain and date palms and papyrus, which they then use into a writing surface. They make that into basically the ancestor of paper. That's how we get our word paper. And they have all of these things that they produce in huge amounts. That being said, there are some things that are quite scarce in Egypt but common elsewhere in the world. Most of the metals that they need to create tools for the Bronze Age and weapons and whatnot are not local to Egypt. They have to trade for those. In addition to that, wood is something that they have to do long distance trade for to get in any significant volume, because Egypt is a desert, and even though they have date palms and other types of trees along those lines near to the river, generally speaking, there just really isn't a lot of wood bearing trees in Egypt at all. And so if they want wood for any reason, whether it's the mast of a ship, those will be developed over years, or whether it's the beams of an interior of a building, they have to trade for them and bring them quite long distance. So wood was a very, very luxurious product, especially woods that could be used for perfume and incense. Cedar, myrrh, frankincense, these are trees and shrubs that are native to this part of the world, native to the Eastern Mediterranean, that produce a sap. In the case of frankincense and myrrh, they produce a sap that is very fragrant and used today fairly heavily in producing incense and in producing perfumes. And cedar also, if you've ever been around a cedar closet or something along those lines, cedar also is a very fragrant wood. It's insect repellent, not that Egypt worries about that too much. And it is therefore a very highly luxurious thing to have. And so having a wooden object was actually quite a luxurious thing in Egypt. In addition to that, they're going to do a lot of trading for gold, copper, tin, ebony, ebony's another wood, ivory, which is elephant, but sometimes sea mammal as well, and other goods that they might need or want from elsewhere. And they're able to do almost as much trade as the king wants to do, because they have this enormous food surplus. They always have this tons and tons and tons of food. And that creates an enormously stable economy in Egypt. They can trade for what they need because they have this big grain surplus. But if worse came to worse, if their trade broke down, Egypt would be basically okay because they have the grain surplus and you can eat grain. If your major product was, let's say, copper production, but your local land was terrible for farming, if trade networks fell apart, you'd be in deep trouble because you can't eat copper. Egypt doesn't have that particular worry. They have food almost all the time until they don't. Now, here's the other side of claiming to be a god. And it's really an interesting question about whether kings in Egypt actually thought they were gods or not. I mean, one hopes or assumes, or I don't know, imagines that the first king to call himself a god might have had an inkling that maybe he's not one. Maybe. But after generation of the same dynasties, and you have somebody born into this ultra royal family that have very separate and special rituals that they performed all during the day. That's what the king would do. He had got up at a certain time, said certain prayers at certain times, he ate certain foods at certain times. His life was very regimented. Once you're the second, third, fourth, fifth, 10th generation of people born, told that you're the physical manifestation of a god on earth, and that after your death you would ascend and take your place among the other gods to look out for Egypt, do you believe that you're a god? I think it's plausible. I don't know. But at any rate, the downside of believing you're a god, or being told that you're a god, or telling everyone else, this we know for sure they did, telling everyone else in Egypt that you're a god, and that it's because of you and your intercession that the Nile floods every year, that the harvest is good every year, that enemies fail to invade every year, that trade prospers every year. The kings of Egypt tell this to people, and year after year, it's true. And so when they say, I'm a god, people are like, cool. Until it doesn't work. Around 2150, there was a period of prolonged drought. And there wasn't much snow in the mountains, and there wasn't much flood in the Nile. And without the water, take a guess what happens to the farms. They dry up, they die. There's not just drought, it is massive famine. And when that happens, if you've been telling everybody you're a god, guess how people react? They immediately blame you. And so the pharaoh is overthrown. There's going to be a period of kind of chaos in between. And then, decades later, another kingdom is going to rise around 2060 BC, thereabouts. And it's going to last until about either 1700 or 1650-ish BC, depending on which historian you talk to. And this will be known as the Middle Kingdom. Just to make it easy for students, I assume. We had the Old Kingdom, now we're in the Middle Kingdom. Next, we'll have the New Kingdom. But for right now, the Middle Kingdom. I'm not going to get into too much detail about the Middle Kingdom. I just want to emphasize a couple of things about it. One, the same are very similar. I mean, there's some subtle change, but very, very similar iconographic. That's the iconography is the use of images, the study of images to present ideas. And the kings of the Middle Kingdom are going to use very much the same style of images that the king of the Old Kingdom did, even though in some cases, here 500 or 600 years later, they show people dressed in the same kinds of outfits, wearing the same kind of crowns, wearing the same symbols of office, in the same kinds of poses as the images of the Old Kingdom pharaohs did, the Old Kingdom kings. I guess you could say they're not really calling themselves pharaohs. And so they're going to rule in very much the same way, and they're going to present themselves stylistically in very much the same way. They're going to claim that same idea the Old Kingdom did of the eternal, unchanging, divine king, the God King. And that the God King, the whole idea of the God King is of a person who is a emanation of a principle, right? There's a principle that is kingness, and each individual person is just a version of that. And so it makes a lot more sense why they always depict themselves looking the same, acting the same, in the same poses, because they're trying to call on this idea of continuity that absolutely characterizes Egypt, unlike pretty much everywhere else in the world. Okay, so the Middle Kingdom is going to reunify Egypt. They are going to move the capital. They're going to go up to about Thebes. It's kind of centrally up the Nile there. They're going to expand the cult of the god Osiris as well. You don't need to know the details of that too much. Okay, another map for you to look at. This purple indicates where the Middle Kingdom was powerful. That darker purple that goes along the Nile, this is areas where they have effective power, where they actually have the ability to enforce whatever rules they might have made, where they have an actual governmental presence. And once again, they're using the Nile as their main avenue of communication, of moving troops if they need to move troops. They're going to knock down any city walls that got built up in the intervening period, and they're going to reunite this into one kingdom as well. That kind of paler purple, the lavender there, that's territory that the Middle Kingdom claims, and it usually is a connection of Egyptian territory into trade routes, caravan routes of the Nubians and others, and it's territory that they claim, but most of it is fairly empty. It's mostly desert. And so they claim jurisdiction there, but they don't necessarily have a physical presence of people in that area, in all of it, all the time. But they nevertheless claim it as part of what they rule. So they expand their influence into the Sinai Peninsula. That's another thing to notice. You see the purple, it connects the Red Sea, it goes along the Nile, and then look at the tippy top of that map in the north there. You see the broad delta of Egypt. This is where the greatest, richest, most fantastic papyrus and grain growing land is. And then if you look how it kind of leaks over there a bit to the east, it's moving on to the Sinai, which is part of the Arabian Peninsula. It's moving out of what you'd call Egypt proper and starting to reach tendrils into territory where other types of kingdoms are going to have their cities. By this point, by 2000 BC, Egypt is not the only game in town. There are other kingdoms elsewhere around the Mediterranean, and Egypt is starting to reach out to have connections to them. Some of this is going to be good. It's going to increase trade and prosperity. Sometimes it works out badly. As you can see here, in 1650, this is the end of the Middle Kingdom. What brings about the end of the Middle Kingdom is a group of people known as the Hyksos. They're going to invade Egypt from outside. This is an Egyptian painting that is going to be, you can tell it's Egyptian. Egyptian kings never, ever, ever in a billion years would depict themselves being defeated. So they only ever depict battles where they win. But the people who are getting trampled here by the Egyptian pharaoh and his chariot, the war chariot, is something they're going to borrow from the Hyksos, in fact, are the Hyksos themselves. So they're being defeated. The Hyksos are actually going to be people who introduced chariot warfare into Egypt, in fact. They're going to invade from outside, as you can see from the map on the right. They're going to invade from the Sinai Peninsula and downward into Egypt, and they're going to encounter the forces of the pharaoh. Now we have another indication of the downside of Egypt's particular advantages. One of the great advantages of Egypt is that typically it's enormously hard to invade. And so because it's enormously hard to invade, the pharaoh doesn't have to waste a lot of money on maintaining a big army that can turn against him anytime one of his generals decides to rebel. That's good until somebody actually manages to invade, and now they're in Egypt and there's no big army to meet them and push them back. And so the Egyptians are initially caught off guard pretty badly. The Hyksos are not only going to invade, they're going to establish their own kingdom in Lower Egypt, all that kind of dark yellow. They're going to rule more or less on their own. And then because the major Middle Kingdom falls apart, the kings that were leading the Middle Kingdom kind of shrink down to that kind of pink oval in the center there, where they kind of cling to power in the middle near Thebes. Of the Nile. And then to their south, another group of people known as the Kushites are going to take over and create a kingdom to the south as well. So the Middle Kingdom kind of breaks into these three components. And for a while again, there's political anarchy. Cities are starting to build walls around themselves. They're all kind of going their own way. Sometimes they're at odds with each other. The Hyksos are ruling for about 100 years. It's a little bit of a mess. Eventually, however, this is going to come to an end with the establishment of what's known as the New Kingdom. It's founded by a guy named Ahmose I, who is going to complete the conquest and expulsion of the Hyksos, and he's going to assert control over the kingdom of the Kush as well. So he's going to reunite all of this in one big swath again and create something called the New Kingdom. And so Upper and Lower Egypt, once again unified. The New Kingdom is different from the other two we've already talked about. In many ways, you see some of the same things, the same themes. You see people who are going to depict themselves as kings of Egypt, as the pharaohs, with the same crown, the same outfit, the same stylistic representation, the same idea of the divine king is going to be promoted. But at the same time, there's a few differences, key differences. The New Kingdom is when Egypt is going to expand to its largest geographical extent. Having learned their lesson from the Hyksos, they don't want to risk having no army and no ability to fight back, and they don't want to risk having people hop across the Sinai Peninsula and come into Egypt again. So the New Kingdom is going to expand their borders to create a buffer state that At the time, they referred to the territory as Canaan, but it's a buffer state that would protect and insulate them from attack from outsiders. So that's what you see here on this map on the left. You see the green is Egyptian claimed territory. The pink is territory where they actually have forces and effective control. So you can see Egypt is going to move away from the Nile a little bit, both along the coast of the Mediterranean and the borders of the territory they claim, and along the coast of the eastern Mediterranean. They're going to move to the north and establish basically part of their kingdom there. Okay, so here we have it. They're also going to advance and expand military spending and usage. They are not going to be building pyramids, neither did the Middle Kingdom. That we quit in the Old Kingdom. Going on. Okay, so one of the things we're going to be talking about with our readings is going to be the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And here is a panel from that Book of the Dead. It's known as the Papyrus of Hunefer, which captures produced about 1300 BC, and it captures a moment in here that is absolutely characteristic of New Kingdom Egyptian kind of religious belief. This is the process of a person who has died and what happens to them in the afterlife. We're going to talk about this in some detail when we do our reading discussion, but you can see the process as it kind of plays out here. On the left, if you see it left to right, you have the person who has deceased, and he's walking along with Anubis. That's the jackal-headed god. Some people have argued lately that he's not in fact jackal-headed, but that's supposed to be a wolf. It's always looked a little pointy for a wolf to me, but whatever. I'm willing to go either way. At any rate, Anubis is taking the soul of the deceased to have his heart weighed on the scales of righteousness. And so the feather of righteousness is kind of there on the one side, on the right, and on the left is a heart. And this is meant to represent the literal heart of the person who has died. And if their heart is weighed down with sins and guilt and having done terrible things, it will be heavy and heavier than the feather of righteousness. If not, it will be lighter. And in this case, this person wins because you can see that the feather is lower down. And if the person fails this test, if their heart is heavier than the feather, then that creature you see there with the crocodile face and the lion body and the hippo butt, that's Ammit. And if you fail, then Ammit devours you. This guy passed, though, so he gets to walk past the scales. And Tot, that's the god with the ibis head, the bird head there, he keeps a record of everything. That's his job. Then the deceased is conducted into the presence of Isis, Osiris, and Nephthys, important gods and goddesses, and thus gets to enter into the halls of righteousness. It's all very great. Okay, so there's this Book of the Dead. We'll talk much more about this in our discussion. We're going to read some passages, some of the elements of the Book of the Dead. And the name Book of the Dead is a little bit misleading. It's actually a collection of different things, texts. Some of them are prayers, some of them are hymns, some of them are recipes, some of them are songs, but it's all the stuff that's kind of associated with funeral services and with people dying and going into the afterlife. A similar kind of idea is attached to the pharaoh. The traditional idea is that the pharaoh will die and then is going to pass through a transmogrification and become a universal divine principle, a person that is going to, a god that is going to look out for and preserve the security of Egypt from beyond the grave. Okay, now, the New Kingdom gives us some of our most exciting individuals, partly just because we have the best records from the New Kingdom, the most that survive. But they're each kind of worth getting into, so I'm going to give you at least a brief overview of some of the more striking individuals of the Egyptian New Kingdom. The first is Hatshepsut. And she's from around 1478 to 1458 BC, is when she's going to rule. And she is unique in that she is described in various places not as the queen of Egypt, but as the female pharaoh, the female king. And she's depicted, as you can see here in this statue, very often in androgynous or overtly masculine ways. So you see here, she's kind of feminine in some ways. Her face is, and her body to some extent, but she's wearing the cot cloth and the symbols of office and power that is traditional to the pharaoh. Now, her story is unique. Um, there is a word for queen in Egyptian, and it is a very common, obviously, it's used all the time, and it refers to the wife of the pharaoh. So the king or pharaoh is the person who's supposed to be in charge. His wife would be the queen. It was very common in Egyptian society, especially by the New Kingdom, to pursue some interesting and unusual for Egypt as it is unusual for everywhere else, kind of family customs. It was not that unusual for in the royal family because they were claiming to be superhuman, they're claiming to be divine, to insist on trying to keep their bloodline as pure as possible. So it was very common for the pharaoh's first wife, or main wife, this royal wife, the one who would be described as a queen, to be part of his immediate family. A sister in some cases, half sister more likely than a full sister, but a half sister, an aunt, a niece, somebody like that. It is sometimes a little squicky to modern audiences, but that was done in ancient Egypt. It was not common in Egyptian society. Only the pharaohs were allowed to do this because they were divine. In addition to that, though, the pharaoh would very frequently marry or have as concubines. So they had official status, but they weren't technically married. They didn't have the same status as a queen would. Women from elsewhere. So they'd be noble daughters. They'd be somebody from outside Egypt that would be, as part of like kind of a treaty arrangement, have traveled to Egypt to marry the pharaoh. So it was very common for the pharaoh to have multiple wives. And so one of them would probably be from this royal family, and some of the rest would be from elsewhere. That's Hatshepsut's story as well. She was the daughter of a pharaoh, Tutmosis I, and she's married to her half brother, Tutmosis II. And so he's going to be the pharaoh, and he dies. And when he dies, his heir apparent, the person he expected to come after him, his son, by his second wife, not Hatshepsut, is Tutmosis III, and he's a kid. And so Hatshepsut is left. Her husband slash half brother is dead. Her stepson slash nephew is now supposed to be in line for the throne, but he's still young. And so she does what is reasonably common in the ancient world. She takes over as regent. She's super royal. Her father was the king. Her husband was the king. She just moves in and she takes over. And she's going to rule side by side with Tutmosis III. Go. Now, her reign was enormously successful. She's going to take over, and we can tell this from some of the images that's left in her tomb and elsewhere, and some other evidence that we've pieced together from other places. She takes over and she's going to rule as the senior pharaoh, as the leader. It's not that uncommon in Egypt to have co-rulers, where you have one kind of main pharaoh will kind of take his heir, or somebody that's supposed to come after him, and kind of push them as like kind of a junior pharaoh. So they have some of the symbols of office, some of the symbols of rulership, but not fully. And that's kind of what Hatshepsut does here. She portrays herself as the pharaoh, and we'll see some of the images there in just a minute. And she describes her own actions, but she'll have Tutmosis III is kind of there as her heir. At any rate, what does Hatshepsut's rule look like? Well, she rules for about 20 years. She never steps down. She never takes a subservient position during those 20 years. And she is enormously successful. She's going to win a bunch of battles early in her career. Then she's going to launch a whole series of trade campaigns where she's going to expand the boundaries of Egypt, and she's going to expand their trade connections so they can bring valuable goods in and open up new avenues of prosperity. This drawing that you see in this slide is a line drawing representing a relief sculpture, so that if you were to show the relief sculpture, it's not painted, it's not picked out in different colors, so it's kind of hard to see all of the detail. But this shows you at least some of what's going on in that. And it has wonderful little cool things in it. This is a depiction of this trade campaign that she went on. And you can see at the top, you see those guys who are carrying trees. They're kind of trees in baskets so they can be replanted. Those are frankincense trees that are being imported to be planted in her garden. Then you've got a guy with a monkey on a leash, people carrying various other things, people bowing down, showing their respect. Then you have the boats that are laden with goods, and then this is just one of the kind of fun side notes. One of the cool things about this picture is that it was meant to depict a sea voyage, and the artist made that clear by the inclusion of the types of fish that you see in those panels there. So you see like a stingray and a flounder and what looks like a shark, and then on the bottom panel you can see a squid. It's in there. So these are meant to be very clearly obvious to people. These aren't river fish. These are ocean fish. And this is a far ranging journey. So Hatshepsut is going to open up new avenues to trade. You can see kind of a close up of that idea there. There's the people carrying the frankincense trees and planting them. She's also going to embark on a massive series of building projects. She's going to have an obelisk built and put up in her honor. That's Hatshepsut's obelisk there at Luxor, Karnak. She's also going to build a fantastic temple, a mortuary temple. So pyramids are no longer being built, but what Hatshepsut has built is this massive temple structure where people could come and worship. It would have these columns there, and then the inside was lavishly decorated with sculpture and art that celebrated her life. And this would be where she would ultimately be buried. And this is in the Valley of the Kings. So we're no longer having the whole pyramids that are right by what is now Cairo. Instead, we've moved well up the Nile into the Valley of the Kings. And you have this beautiful temple structure at Deir el-Bahri. Okay. Now, this is the beginning of the mystery of Hatshepsut, because well, at least until the 1830s, people had no idea she existed. Her name had been stricken off. Even though she was this exciting figure, female king, her name had been stricken off the official king lists in the ancient world times. And some of the mystery of her starts being cracked when archaeologists in the 1800s travel to Deir el-Bahri and they start looking at the inscriptions. Now, this is the time when hieroglyphic is they've just barely cracked the code and have begun translating it with the help of the Rosetta Stone. This is a wonderful piece that was produced much later, but it ends up being the Rosetta Stone ends up being the artifact that cracks the code for modern people to understand Egyptian hieroglyphic, because it is an artifact that has the same text carved into it in two different languages. It's in three different styles of two different languages. It's in hieroglyphic, it's in Demotic, which is the more modern, later Egyptian writing, and then on the bottom of the Rosetta Stone is Greek. And so because this artifact exists, and it was produced much, 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 much later when Alexander the Great's generals had taken over Egypt and were ruling it, but because this artifact exists, in the 1800s, scholars were just translating and figuring out what all of the beautiful writing in tombs and temples and on papyrus scrolls actually said. And so while they were doing that, one of these scholars that worked on it, he made a lot of blunders, but he ends up being kind of a funny figure. Jean-François Champollion, you don't have to know his name, was looking around Deir el-Bahri, and he's like, this is so weird. There's all these depictions. Like, if you see this picture, the person on the right there wearing the crown, that is the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, that's wearing the same sort of kilt that is the standard attire of a man in Egypt, that has the sort of pectoral beautiful decorative necklace that is the pharaoh's necklace, that has all of she's got a fake beard on. The beard was always fake, whether you're a man or not. But this male figure, which is labeled as the pharaoh, as the king, has this name. Menenthi is how he described it, but Hatshepsut is the one we know. They have this name, Hatshepsut, I've never heard of. And then this person who's smaller there, the subservient person behind the pharaoh, is Tutmosis III. And that's one of the pharaohs on the list. So who is this big person? Who is this main pharaoh? And then on top of who is this main pharaoh, all of the noun forms are in the feminine. It's like, so it's a female pharaoh, but why? And why if it's a female pharaoh is she described and depicted as a male? This was very confusing to poor Champollion, and it is a little bit surprising. It is, in fact, a depiction of Hatshepsut, and it was commissioned and paid for and approved by Hatshepsut during her life. And it shows you just how important the notion of continuity was for the rulers of Egypt. Even though Hatshepsut is female and has no problem with that and has no problem admitting it, when she shows a picture of herself doing official pharaoh business, she will have herself visually depicted as male. Not necessarily because she wishes she were male, but because that's how the principle of Pharaoh is depicted. She is one version, one emanation of the great eternal Pharaoh, in other words. And so regardless of how she personally looks, she shows herself depicted just like we saw on that Narmer Palette way back in 3200 BC, smiting her enemies. She's standing there with the mace in her hand, about to smite some enemies. There aren't any enemies in this particular picture, but that's that same pose. Okay. So why was she such a mystery? Why did she get struck off the list? Now I'm just going to give you the fast version here. Well, a lot of her monuments outside her temple were damaged or destroyed or erased, and even some of them inside the temple, as a matter of fact. And this happened in the ancient world about 20 years after she died. Now the reason for it, I'm just going to give you the fast version. And you can see this might not show up that well if you're watching this on, it's a fairly small image. It works better if I have the projector, but you'll have to bear with me. You see there's a little figure there, a little man. Next to the man, if you look along the row of his feet, like where his feet are, you might be able to see there's something a little rough about the stone. And if you look very carefully or kind of relax your eyes, you might see there is the outline of a very tall person, so that level with his elbow is the hem of this person's kilt. So it was a very big, huge, tall person that was there originally. That was originally Hatshepsut, depicted as a male pharaoh, and later literally got chipped off of the stone badly enough you can still see her there. But still, what happened? Why was she erased? Well, we don't know for certain, but the likely candidate is probably her nephew slash stepson who came after her. But the story isn't as straightforward as you might think. You might think, oh, he probably hated her. She was the regent. When she finally died, he got rid of all her stuff. Not really. He didn't get rid of her images and her monuments till 20 years after she was dead. And during her lifetime, he and his stepmom seem to have gotten along really well. She puts him in charge of the army several times, which you don't do if you're afraid someone's not loyal to you. And they don't really seem to have had any tension between them at all. So it's even more mysterious. There's only a few kind of plausible conjecture reasons I've seen put forward. And the most believable one that I've seen has to do with the fact of that kind of crazy family dynasty thing I've already talked about, where Egyptian pharaohs frequently marry into their own family, have this kind of obsession with pure blood, and that impacting succession. As you can imagine, when you marry close relatives, you dramatically increase the chance of birth defects. It's just the way it works, especially if you do this more than one generation in a row. Now, Egypt is mostly spared the worst consequences of this practice because they're not exclusive about it. So in other words, the pharaoh may marry his sister as part of their celebration of family purity, but at the same time he'd also marry a bunch of other people he's not related to, and it's more often than not the child of one of these other wives that is going to actually inherit. So there's at least some limiting factor there, and you can see that play out. The deal with Hatshepsut is this: she was the daughter of the old pharaoh and his royal wife. Her brother was raised to be pharaoh beside her and then married to her to bolster his claim because he was the son of a minor wife, one of those kind of concubines. His mom wasn't as royal as Hatshepsut. You don't have to follow all of this. It's going to get a little complicated, so just bear with me here for a second. So Hatshepsut and her brother husband have a daughter, Neferuri. But her brother husband has a son with one of his not related to him wives. And that son is Tutmosis III. So it's her stepson / nephew who's going to kind of succeed Hatshepsut and rule alongside her and then eventually take over. Well, everything goes smoothly until Hatshepsut dies. Tutmosis III takes over. He marries and has a royal wife, and then he has a royal son who dies. And the next person in line is Tutmosis III's son, who is the child of a not royal outsider Egyptian. Tutmosis III himself is the son of a not royal outsider Egyptian. And so altogether, the new heir apparent, the kid who's going to inherit Amenhotep II there, is really, his bloodline is looking pretty shabby compared to Hatshepsut's daughter, Neferuri. So, one of the plausible explanations for what happens with Hatshepsut is that Tutmosis III gets a little panicked once his eldest son dies, and he's afraid that his younger son, whose bloodline is not so pure, might have a hard time pressing his claim to inherit the throne of Egypt if Neferuri, who's super royal, the daughter of a super royal, super pure-blooded, if she pushes her claim forward and everybody remembers that her mom was in fact great at this whole pharaoh business. So he goes through 20 years after Hatshepsut is dead and chisels all the pictures of her off of everything and erases her from all the king lists and pretends she was never the pharaoh and it was just him the whole time, because he's so concerned that people are going to back another female pharaoh over his son. So that's a plausible explanation. That's one of the ones we go with. Okay, so another rebel and exciting figure from Egypt and the New Kingdom is Akhenaten. Akhenaten is fascinating because he's going to do almost the unthinkable. Remember what I told you about how important continuity is for these rulers of Egypt. They depict themselves. Hatshepsut depicts herself as a man because it's so important to her to show the same picture of Pharaoh from 3200 BC right up to her own day, 2,000 years later. Akhenaten, therefore, he's a really radical figure because what he does is he dispenses with it. He's like, you know what? I'm going to put aside the traditional pantheon of Egyptian gods. They're polytheist in Egypt and they have a number of gods. I'm going to put that all aside, along with all of the temples and all of the priests who serve those gods. I'm going to push them over, and instead I'm going to introduce the worship of one god, the sun god Aten. And I'm going to rename myself Akhenaten, or the living spirit of Aten. And everybody is going to worship me as the physical manifestation of the one true God. We're going to get rid of all the rest of them. As you can imagine, when you announce to people they have to give up the religion they have followed their entire lives, it tends to go over like a lead balloon. And that happens with Akhenaten. He announces to everybody, we're giving up the pantheon of gods and we're going to be all monotheist now. Some might suggest this is an unhinged kind of move, but there is some method to this madness. By doing this, Akhenaten has an opportunity. By making this break, and he does make a break, he moves the capital to Amarna, he changes the style of depiction, he moves away from the traditional way pharaohs are depicted. You can see this early form of this new Amarna style in the statue to the left there. He probably did have a long face, but he begins depicting himself and his wife and other people in this very odd way so that their figures and faces no longer look quite human. They start looking alien, more and more alien, with really elongated features and facial expressions. And they look odd. Some of the things are the same, like the cot cloth and the aureus, etc. here, but others really begin to transform. So he changes the way the pharaoh looks in art, and then on top of that, he's going to get rid of these traditional religious practices, religious cult, and by doing that, he does accomplish something. It's not just all change for the sake of it. By attacking traditional Egyptian religion, what he does is he creates a test. It's a test of loyalty in many ways, especially for the priestly class. Priests and scribes are the people who keep records in Egypt, much the same as they are elsewhere in the Bronze Age in the ancient world. And so they naturally enough are the ones who collect taxes. They're the ones who serve as the liaison between the government, between the king, and the people. Ordinary people don't read and write. And so if they want to know what the new latest proclamation of the king is, they have to go down to the priesthood, the temple priesthood, and hear somebody who is of this scribal class read it out to them. If they want to send a letter, they have to go to that person. And so these temples tended to be areas of worship. They tended to be areas of interaction with the community. They tended to be areas where community interfaced with government representatives as well. And so by challenging this whole class of people, because nobody's going to be more offended than temple priests, by challenging this whole class of people, Akhenaten is able to test them. Are they loyal to him? Or are they willing to break away and do their own thing and act with kind of local support and try to assert their independence? And it gives him an opportunity. If local priests try to rebel, if they push back, if they refuse to obey, he's now spotted them as people who aren't so necessarily loyal, and he can swoop down on them and deal with them. Now, he gets away with this. He doesn't live a particularly long time. He doesn't rule a particularly long time, or it would be a totally different story about Egyptian religion, very likely. He's only going to be king for about 3 years. He tries to make this change, and then he happens to die. It wasn't related to the whole changing religion business. But he tries to make this change. He tries to make this transformation. He puts it in motion. He hangs on to power, largely because he has support among the army. And then he dies. And when he dies, he leaves behind a young successor. Somebody who is not powerful in himself, somebody who doesn't have strong connections to the army yet, somebody who is only in his teens, somebody who's not particularly healthy, as it turns out, his son, Tutankhamun. During his youth, he was named Tutankhaten after Akhenaten. But he's going to change his name, and as you can probably tell from the beautiful death mask here, he is going to change back to the traditional religious practice of Egypt, largely because Tutankhamun is not in a position where he's strong enough. Akhenaten had only begun this process, and then he's dead. The priests are all angry. The army isn't necessarily super loyal to him. He's kind of floundering as this young ruler. And so the path of least resistance for him is to re-embrace traditional Egyptian religion. He goes back to it. So he's going to re-adopt that, and he's going to, again, switch back to traditional depictions of the pharaoh. He's going to switch back to the traditional veneration of the pantheon of gods. His co-ruler for a while is somebody named Nefertiti. Wasn't his mother, very likely. We don't think. The records are a little unclear here. But she was married to Akhenaten, and she was kind of his co-supporter in his radical new change process. But she is going to kind of fade into obscurity after the death of Akhenaten, and all of those plans kind of fail. Instead, Tutankhamun is going to take over. This is the famous King Tut, in case you were wondering. You probably weren't if you see the mask. He was not a particularly wealthy pharaoh. He was not a particularly powerful pharaoh. He was not a particularly successful pharaoh or one who ruled a very long time. But he is one of the most famous rulers of anywhere because his tomb, unlike basically all of the rest of them, his tomb remained intact and unspoiled until the modern era. And so archaeologists are going to be able to break into it, find all of the treasures that were arranged around him intact. And so they have all of this wealth of fabulous things to look at, all in situ, the way it was placed in the ancient world. And so the treasures of King Tut become this kind of internationally famous archaeological find, or possibly the most internationally famous archaeological find ever. And it sets off a wave of Egyptomania in Europe at the time and the Americas. Everybody was fascinated and in love with the idea of King Tut in the 1800s. So at any rate, he was not a particularly important figure in Egypt, but he goes down in history as the image of this lavish wealth and tremendous power, just because his tomb was not actually despoiled. Okay. All right, last little bits and pieces for today. Just as quick move through. The New Kingdom is not the time when they built the pyramids. It is, however, the time when Egypt is going to reach the greatest extent of its wealth and power. It struggles. There was Shepsut, then you had that whole Akhenaten trying to change religion business, then you have King Tut. He was young, he struggled, he died young. And then there's going to be a period of some disorder, and the Ramses are going to emerge on the scene. Ramses the First was a vizier. He was one of those administrators who serves the pharaoh. He's going to create a new dynasty for his family. And Ramses II, who's going to rule between 1279 and 1213 BC, is known as Ramses the Great. He is going to be the one that really pulls the new kingdom together. They're going to expand trade, they're going to expand territory, they're going to expand the great wealth and political influence of Egypt. This is when Egypt becomes the most powerful it will ever be in the ancient times. So, what does it look like? It looks like this under the Ramses. You can see this bright green. This is all Egyptian territory. And you can see how they're moving out of the Nile area and along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. If you look at the map on the right, you can see all those little arrows. These are Egyptian trade routes. The red arrows are where they are dealing with caravan routes from the Nubians, and the green arrows are where they're dealing with sea trade through the Mediterranean. They're bringing in the raw materials for bronze, they're trading in gold, they're trading in wood, they're trading in all kinds of things that they wanted and exchanging the huge agricultural surplus of Egypt in order to get all of this wealth from around the world. And they're having a tremendously successful time of it. And so they create this buffer zone along the eastern Mediterranean to make it more difficult for any of the rising kingdoms elsewhere to invade them. And the one kingdom they're especially worried about is that red part to the north there, the kingdom of the Hittites. I'm not going to get into the Hittites. They're a fabulous, exciting group of people centered in Anatolia, what is now modern Turkey, and some of Syria. And they establish a large regional empire as well. And they're going to end up being the kind of chief rivals for power with the New Kingdom Egyptians. They're going to fight back and forth. As a piece of trivia, here you see a statue. It's fallen at this point, you can see, of Ramses the Great that's kind of being restored and preserved by museum workers. Next to it, you can see a treaty. It's just in fragments, but we have fragments of both sides. That's what makes it so incredibly fantastic. We have fragments of both sides of this treaty between the Hittites and the New Kingdom Egyptians, between Ramses and Hattusilus, the king of the Hittites. And what's hilarious about it, the two sides had fought and established a new boundary, a border between their two states. As what's hilarious about it is that they say basically the same thing, but in reverse. So the Egyptian side says, "Great God King Ramses has in his infinite mercy allowed his enemies to live." And on the other side, you have Hattusilus say, "The great King Hattusilus has in his infinite mercy allowed his enemies to live. We've drawn this boundary. They agreed not to cross it. That's the deal now." So it's just a little piece of trivia, but it's like a fabulous, wonderful, rare, really rare example of where you have physical remnants, documents that are preserved from both sides of a treaty that show the kind of balance of power and how both kings are using similar techniques to bolster their own PR status back at home. Okay, so this is where we're going to end today, and we'll have a little bit more next week on the collapse and end of the Egyptian kingdom, new kingdom. This is an image of Ramses II, and it's from a site known as Abdu Simbel. And you can see here, this picture looks almost identical in the same theme and basic layout. You have the pharaoh. In this case, he's got the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt on. He's holding a mace in one hand. He's gripping his enemies. In this case, Ramses has gone one better than Narmer from the Narmer Palette, in that he's gripping like 10 enemies all at once. You can see by the number of arms that are all there. And he's going about to smite his enemies with his mace. It's the same image. Ramses is putting this down in 1200 BC. Narmer was from 3200 BC. 2,000 years of pictorial continuity, of the kind of cultural, religious, even though it is not at all the same from beginning to end, there is a tremendous stability in Egypt. In the way that the leaders conduct themselves and the way that they portray themselves. And that stability is the one thing, if you take nothing else away from this lesson, that you should remember that makes Egypt so special. It's very, very wealthy and very, very stable compared to everyone else. So next time, we're going to talk about what happens to the new kingdom. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.